On October 8, 2011, a Saturday afternoon, two children disappeared from Fresno, California. Sara Smith was 6 years old. Her brother George was 2. Their father, Daniel Smith, reported them missing that same evening. He said he had taken them to a park, Woodward Park, and lost sight of them. Law enforcement mobilized immediately. Search teams combed the park. The public was alerted. Volunteers came forward. But Sara and George were never at Woodward Park. Authorities would later determine that by the time Daniel Smith called his brother to say the children were lost, the children had been dead for hours or were dying. This is not a story about a mystery. There is no mystery. The courts of Fresno County established what happened with exhaustive precision. This is a story about how the truth was nearly buried and how it survived. Daniel Smith and Emily Smith were a couple living in Fresno County, California. Together, they had 2 children, Sara, born in 2005, and George, born in 2009. Court records and testimony would later establish that the relationship between Daniel and Emily had been deteriorating for some time. In September 2011, Emily told Daniel that she intended to divorce him. According to prosecutors, it was at this point, September 2011, that Daniel Smith formed the intention to kill his children. The prosecution argued, and the jury agreed, that his motivation was revenge against his wife. Daniel Smith's state of mind in the weeks before October 8th was partially documented through medical records introduced at trial. He had been seen by a psychiatrist, a doctor who had treated him approximately 3 years prior, and had recently returned for consultation. That psychiatrist prescribed 2 medications, Orfidol, an anxiolytic, and Modivin, an antidepressant. Court records show that Daniel Smith purchased both of these medications on September 29, 2011. According to expert psychiatric testimony presented during the trial, Daniel Smith did not suffer from any mental disorder that would have impaired his judgment or understanding of his actions. Psychiatrists and psychologists who examined him reached this conclusion uniformly. He knew what he was doing. He chose to do it. Daniel Smith's parents owned a rural property in Fresno County, a family estate referred to throughout the trial by its original Spanish name, Las Quemadillas. The property was surrounded by open land and orange groves. It sat away from the road. From the exterior, visibility into certain sections of the estate was obstructed by trees and terrain. Investigators would later determine that Daniel Smith chose this property deliberately, not because it was convenient, but because it was private. He had grown up with it. He knew its layout. He knew where he could not be seen. Months before October 8th, Daniel Smith began preparing this property for what he intended to do there. The preparation for the murders of Sara and George Smith did not happen impulsively. According to evidence presented at trial, Daniel Smith conducted systematic preparations across multiple days in multiple locations. September 29, 2011. Court records document that on this date, Daniel Smith purchased the prescription medications Orfidol and Modivin. These are the medications he had recently been prescribed. They would later be identified by the prosecution as the substances used to sedate his children. Between October 5th and October 7th, 2011. During this period, investigators determined that Daniel Smith collected firewood and made the purchases that would become central to the investigation. At a gas station in Bakersfield, California, a location relevant to his movements during this period, Daniel Smith purchased more than 270 liters of diesel fuel. This purchase was made in large quantities. It was not incidental. The gas station workers from Bakersfield, California, who processed those transactions, would later be called to testify at trial. They confirmed the purchase. According to the prosecution's reconstruction, the diesel fuel was brought to the family property. That fuel, approximately 80 liters of which would be used on October 8th, was stored in his car's boot and then removed to Las Quemadillas during his visit to the property on October 7th. Court records also established that Daniel Smith identified the specific location on the estate where the act would take place. He chose a spot among the orange trees, away from the property's edges without visibility from outside, a place where a fire could burn for hours and not be seen from the road. In addition to the physical preparations, Daniel Smith also prepared the cover story he would need. Court records established that on the morning of October 6, 2011, Daniel Smith conducted what can only be described as a rehearsal for the disappearance simulation he was planning. He was accompanying his sister, Laura's children, his nephews, on their way to school. According to court records, he briefly left the children alone for a few moments, observing how they behaved, testing what a momentary loss of supervision looked like in practice. He was not forgetful. He was not distracted. He was, according to the evidence, preparing a credible account of how a parent might lose track of two small children in a public place. He studied his own alibi before he needed it. On October 7, 2011, Daniel Smith picked up his two children in Bakersfield, California, and drove with them to Fresno County. This was a scheduled custody arrangement. He was to have them for the weekend. According to court records, he first went to his parents' house and then to his sister Laura's house, where he left the children temporarily. From there, he drove to Las Quemadillas, the family estate, to remove the diesel fuel from the boot of his car and leave it at the property. He was organizing the site, positioning what he needed. That evening, he also spoke to his siblings about the following day. He suggested to them that they gather in the afternoon at a place described in testimony as the City of Children area, along with their respective children, ostensibly for a family outing. The prosecution characterized this invitation as an attempt to create social corroboration for his presence near a public park on October 8th. The family did not agree on a firm arrangement. The plan to meet was ambiguous. That same evening, Daniel Smith told his mother that he would not be joining her for lunch on October 8th. He said he was meeting friends. This was false. Court records reconstruct the morning of October 8, 2011, in considerable detail. Daniel Smith spent the morning at his sister Laura's house with his children and his nephews, the children of Laura and her husband, Michael Carter. Laura and Michael were out shopping. Daniel was alone in the house with the children until approximately 1:30 in the afternoon. When Laura and Michael Carter returned, Michael Carter drove Daniel and his two children, Sara and George, to the grandparents' house to pick up Daniel's car. Daniel stopped only briefly at his parents' home, long enough to give the impression that he was leaving to have lunch with friends. This impression was deliberately constructed. There were no friends. There was no lunch. Daniel Smith left with his two children in his car. He drove toward Las Quemadillas. During the drive, or after they arrived at the estate, Daniel Smith gave his children an undetermined number of the prescription medications he had purchased 10 days earlier, Orfidol and Modivin. The medications were administered to court records are precise about the time of arrival. At approximately 1:48 p.m. on October 8, 2011, Daniel Smith made a phone call to Emily, the children's mother, without being able to reach her. He was already at the estate. He called from Las Quemadillas. He did not leave. He had decided to proceed regardless. What happened at Las Quemadillas on the afternoon of October 8, 2011, was established through forensic analysis, physical evidence recovered at the site, and expert testimony presented over weeks of trial proceedings. According to that evidence, Daniel Smith had prepared, in advance, a structure designed for one purpose: the complete destruction of human remains. He had positioned this structure among the orange trees, in a location without visibility from the property's exterior. He laid his children down. The court record states it was impossible to determine at what point they died. He set fire to the pyre. The fuel he burned comprised approximately 250 kilograms of firewood and approximately 80 liters of diesel fuel. According to forensic expert testimony, the fire reached temperatures of up to 1,200 degrees Celsius. For reference, a standard crematorium operates at between 870 and 980 degrees Celsius. The effect, according to expert testimony, was comparable to industrial cremation. At those temperatures, the soft tissue of the children's bodies disappeared rapidly. What remained, barely, were fragments of bone. Daniel Smith remained at the site until approximately 5:30 p.m., continuously feeding the fire with diesel fuel to sustain the temperature, ensuring the most complete destruction possible. Some residents in the surrounding area would later testify that they had noticed an unpleasant burning smell that afternoon. None reported seeing a column of smoke. The location he had chosen had done its work. At some point after 5:30 p.m., Daniel Smith left Las Quemadillas and drove to the neighborhood surrounding Woodward Park, a large public park in Fresno that he had selected in advance as the setting for his fabricated account. According to court records, at 6:01 p.m., he parked his car approximately 300 meters from the park. He then sent a text message to his brother, James Smith, suggesting that he was currently near the park with his children. Shortly afterward, the children's mother, Emily, called him from her home. He took the call. She would later testify that when Daniel informed her the children had disappeared, she knew in that moment that she would never see them again. At 6:18 p.m., 17 minutes after parking, Daniel Smith called his brother James to report that his children were lost. The calls multiplied, relatives were mobilized, his brother and his brother-in-law arrived at the park to begin searching. At 6:41 p.m., Daniel Smith called the emergency services number and reported the disappearance of his children, provoking the official police response. At 8:43 p.m., he arrived at the Fresno police station to file a formal disappearance report. The investigation began. The initial police response proceeded on the premise that two young children had wandered away from their father at Woodward Park. Search teams were deployed. The area was examined. Public appeals were made. No trace of Sara or George Smith was found at or near the park because they had never been there. As the investigation continued, and as Daniel Smith's account was subjected to scrutiny, attention began to shift toward the family property, Las Quemadillas. A search of the estate would reveal what Daniel Smith had hoped the fire had taken beyond recovery. It had not. In the remnants of the bonfire on the Las Quemadillas estate, investigators recovered a collection of bone fragments. The question of what those fragments represented would become the most consequential scientific dispute in the entire case, and one of the most publicly scrutinized forensic controversies in Fresno County legal history. The bone fragments recovered from Las Quemadillas were sent from Fresno to the relevant Forensic Analysis Unit, the California Department of Justice Forensic Unit, for expert examination. The forensic analyst assigned to examine the remains was Dr. Karen Lewis, a forensic anthropologist with the scientific police. Dr. Lewis's report concluded that the bones found in the bonfire did not correspond to human remains. According to her findings, the fragments belonged to animals. Specifically, she identified them as the remains of rodents and small carnivores. This conclusion, delivered with professional authority by a credentialed expert operating within the official investigative framework, had immediate and far-reaching consequences. If there were no human remains, there was, technically, no body. Without a body, the evidentiary foundation of a murder investigation was severely undermined. The investigation stalled. The resolution of the case was delayed substantially. The children's mother, Emily Smith, did not accept the conclusion. Emily Smith, through her legal representation, requested an independent expert analysis of the recovered remains. The second expert engaged was Dr. Robert Hayes, a forensic anthropologist retained by the prosecution. Dr. Hayes examined the fragments. His findings contradicted Dr. Lewis's conclusions directly. According to Dr. Hayes's analysis, the bone fragments recovered from the Las Quemadillas bonfire included human bone material. Furthermore, the characteristics of the fragments were consistent with the bone structure of the children aged 2 and 6 years old. The fragments were not rodent bones. They were the remains of Sara and George Smith. A third analysis was subsequently conducted by Dr. William Turner, an additional expert whose findings confirmed those of Dr. Hayes. The remains were human. Confronted with 2 independent expert reports directly contradicting her own, Dr. Karen Lewis retracted her original conclusion. She was subsequently dismissed from the case. The investigation resumed on the correct premise. The children were dead, their remains had been found, and Daniel Smith was responsible. As the investigation progressed under the supervision of the presiding judge, a further complication emerged that would become one of the central arguments of Daniel Smith's defense. Errors in the chain of custody of the physical evidence, specifically the bone fragments collected from the bonfire at Las Quemadillas, were identified during the judicial review. The fragments had been transported from Fresno to the California Department of Justice Forensic Unit for analysis. During the judicial proceedings, the judge called Dr. Lewis to testify following the refutation of her initial report. In the course of that testimony, she was shown photographic evidence of the collected samples. Dr. Lewis stated that sample number 8 appeared to be missing from the photographic record. This observation became, in the language of the defense, a hypothetical rupture of the chain of custody. The defense argued that the integrity of the evidence had been compromised, that samples had gone missing, and that the forensic conclusions built on that evidence could not be trusted. The prosecution and the California Department of Justice Forensic Unit offered an explanation. Serafine Castro, the chief commissioner of the California Department of Justice Forensic Unit at the relevant time, testified at trial that sample number 8 may have disintegrated, that its condition at the time of collection could account for its absence from later documentation. The jury weighed this argument. The defense would press it throughout the trial. It did not prevail. The trial of Daniel Smith opened on June 17, 2013, in the Fresno County Superior Court. A jury was selected consisting of 7 women and 4 men. The charges were serious: 2 counts of murder and a 3rd charge related to the false simulation of a kidnapping, the fabricated disappearance narrative Daniel Smith had constructed and executed on October 8, 2011. The prosecution, the private civil prosecution representing Emily Smith, and the defense all prepared to present their cases to the jury over the weeks that followed. The trial produced a substantial record of testimony. The key witnesses and their accounts are documented in the official court record. Daniel Smith, the defendant. Daniel Smith pleaded not guilty. In his testimony, he denied killing his children. He denied having administered any pills or medications to them. His denial was total. Emily Smith, the children's mother. Emily testified that she had decided to divorce Daniel because her life had been unhappy. She stated that when Daniel called to tell her the children had disappeared, she knew at that moment that she would not see them again. Court records preserve this statement without elaboration. Its weight is sufficient. James Smith, Daniel's brother. James Smith, Daniel's brother, had received the text message on the evening of October 8th, suggesting Daniel was near the park with the children. He was among those mobilized to search. He did not testify against his brother's guilt directly, but his account established the sequence of the false alarm Daniel had constructed. Michael Carter, brother-in-law Michael Carter, husband of Laura Smith, testified that he did not believe Daniel would have killed the children. However, he stated clearly that Daniel was responsible for their disappearance. It is a careful distinction. The jury heard it. Olivia Parker, the cousin. Olivia Parker, a cousin of Emily Smith, had visited Daniel Smith while he was held on remand awaiting trial. According to her testimony, Daniel Smith told her on not one, not two, but 3 separate occasions that he had killed the children. This testimony, direct, repeated, unambiguous, was among the most significant presented at trial. Gas station workers from Bakersfield, California, workers at the gas station where Daniel Smith had purchased over 270 liters of diesel fuel, testified in court, confirming the transaction. The purchase was documented, it was deliberate, its purpose was not disputed by the physical evidence. Laura Smith and other family members, Daniel's parents and siblings, declined to testify. They exercised their right not to give evidence against a family member. Residents near Las Quemadillas. Several residents in the area surrounding the estate testified that on the afternoon of October 8, 2011, they had detected an unpleasant burning smell. None had seen a column of smoke. Their accounts were consistent with a sustained fire designed to minimize visibility while maintaining extreme temperature. Psychiatric and psychological experts. Multiple mental health professionals who had examined Daniel Smith testified at trial. Their unanimous conclusion: Daniel Smith did not suffer from any mental disorder that would have diminished his responsibility for his actions. Forensic experts, Dr. Robert Hayes, Dr. William Turner, and additional medical examiners testified that the remains recovered from Las Quemadillas were of human origin, consistent with children of the ages of Sara and George Smith. Their testimony was not successfully challenged. On July 8, 2013, after weeks of testimony and the presentation of physical, forensic, and circumstantial evidence, the parties delivered their final arguments. Daniel Smith, through his defense, maintained his plea of not guilty. The public prosecutor told the jury that the evidence before them demonstrated, in the clearest possible terms, that Daniel Smith had murdered his children in the cruelest possible way and then burned their corpses. The defense returned, as it had throughout the trial, to the chain of custody question, the missing sample, the procedural irregularities, the suggestion that the evidence could not be trusted in its entirety. The jury retired to deliberate. On July 12, 2013, the jury returned its verdict. They found Daniel Smith guilty. The decision was unanimous. On July 22, 2013, the Fresno County Superior Court sentenced Daniel Smith to 40 years in prison, 20 years for each murder. The court cited the familial relationship between the perpetrator and the victims, the extensive premeditation, and the cruelty of the method as aggravating circumstances that weighed upon the sentence. Daniel Smith's defense did not accept the verdict. The case moved through successive levels of appeal. First appeal, Fresno to the State Appellate Court. The defense appealed the sentence, emphasizing the chain of custody questions as the primary grounds. The State Court of Appeal rejected the appeal in November 2013, confirming the 40-year sentence. Second appeal, the California Supreme Court. The defense brought the matter before the California Supreme Court. In July 2014, the Supreme Court rejected the appeal unanimously. The conviction stood. Sentence reduction, U.S. Sentencing Guidelines. The defense subsequently filed a motion for sentence reduction. The sentence was later reduced to a maximum of 25 years in accordance with U.S. Key sentencing guidelines regarding cumulative maximum penalties. Daniel Smith had been convicted of 3 offenses, 2 murders and the simulation of a kidnapping. The reduction was a procedural legal outcome, not a revision of the conviction or the findings of guilt. Daniel Smith was convicted of the murders of Sara Smith and George Smith. That conviction was confirmed by every court that considered it. The reduction from 40 to 25 years drew significant public attention when it was announced in March 2015. The reduction did not represent a softening of the legal findings. Daniel Smith was not found less guilty. The facts of the case were not revised. The court applied a statutory maximum that caps the total prison term a person may serve across multiple convictions within a single case. The law operated as written. The questions raised by that outcome, about whether a statutory cap adequately addresses crimes of this character are questions for legislators, not for this documentary. Emily Smith said in her trial testimony that when Daniel called to say the children had disappeared, she knew she would not see them again. The documentary record does not dwell on what this knowledge cost her. Court transcripts are precise instruments. They capture what is said, not what is carried. What the court record does capture is this: Emily Smith did not accept the initial forensic conclusion that the remains found at Las Quemadillas were not human. She retained independent expertise. She pressed for a second opinion. She was correct. It was her persistence, expressed through legal channels, through refusal to let the first wrong answer stand, that allowed the investigation to reach its conclusion. One of the most technically significant elements of this case concerns what the fire did and did not destroy. Daniel Smith chose a method designed to eliminate all physical evidence of his act. He selected a temperature achieved through the combination of firewood and diesel fuel that the prosecution described as equivalent to industrial cremation. He stayed for nearly 4 hours to ensure the fire burned completely. And yet, bone survives fire. Bone, properly examined by a trained and careful forensic anthropologist, can be identified, can be aged, can be understood. This case entered the public record not only because of the crime at its center, but because of the forensic failure that temporarily obscured it. The initial misidentification of the bone fragments as animal remains was not fraud. It was error. Forensic anthropology operates under conditions of uncertainty. Remains subjected to extreme temperature lose characteristics. Identification becomes difficult. But the initial error and the delay it caused raises questions about procedure, about the independence of expert review, about what safeguards exist when the first conclusion is wrong. On July 22, 2013, Daniel Smith was sentenced to 40 years in prison for double murder. Following appeals and a sentence reduction motion, the term was reduced to 25 years under applicable statutory law. The conviction was never overturned. The crimes were established to have been premeditated, committed against his own children, and carried out with cruelty.